For more resources, visit rym.org.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.
The Local Youth Worker is a daily podcast that's centered on 5 questions each week. Ranging from the practical to the professional, we're looking for answers to the questions you're asking. Whether you're in full-time, part-time, or even volunteer youth ministry, this podcast is for you.
Hey everybody, we're back with Russ Whitfield. Yesterday we started talking about the topic of diversity and really how this came from one of Russ's sermons at our summer conference in Colorado. Russ, we kind of broadened that definition yesterday, but something else you talked about in that sermon, really you read from Acts chapter 10. And you in that sermon brought us all the way to the beginning of Acts and then kind of started working through it. And you talked about how, most scholars say there are, 4 conversions that took place kind of in that section of Scripture. Would you briefly just walk us through those 4 conversions and then why you argue in some ways that there's a possible 5th conversion that takes place?
Yes. So in the narrative of Acts, I think it's important to try and not only pick up on the immediate context of particular passages, but to try and get a sense of what the overall strategy and message of the author is. So if you follow what Luke is doing in Acts, it starts with the call of Jesus, his final words to his disciples, that they're going to receive power and they're going to be his witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. And then what you see happen is a rich engagement after Pentecost, on Pentecost and after Pentecost, with Jerusalem, Judea. There are lots of conversions. There are lots of people coming into the church, but they get stuck in this groove. And what happens is that the Lord sends persecution that comes to a head in the martyrdom of Stephen in chapter 7. And then immediately after that, what you see is the fulfillment, the beginnings of that fulfillment of the word of Jesus, that they will be his witnesses. And so the first thing you see happening in Acts chapter 8 is the gospel goes to the Samaritans, and they're shocked. And the Samaritans come to faith, the Spirit is poured out, and they're like, it's almost like what Jesus said was true. And then immediately after that, you get an Ethiopian eunuch. He's a man of power where he comes from. He's a black African. And you're starting to get to the ends of the earth. It's the beginnings of that. And then you get, the most radical opponent of the Christian faith, Saul of Tarsus, who's converted, and he becomes the greatest advocate. That's conversion 3. So you go Samaritans, you go Ethiopian eunuch, then you go Saul of Tarsus. So you're getting all of the unlikelies, right? All of the people that those disciples would not have been inclined to include in God's story. They wouldn't have been included. Then you get to the 4th one, which is Cornelius. That's what New Testament scholars typically identify as the 4 major conversions where the gospel is going global. The gospel is spreading. There's a globalization of the gospel. But I think when you look at the way that Peter is framed up in Acts chapter 10, I am led to believe that Luke is trying to point something out to us in terms of a change that Peter undergoes, that everyone in God's church, like Peter's a stand-in for the change that all of us need. And I use the language of conversion intentionally, not to diminish the importance of conversion as we think about salvation and theology of salvation, but I think it's to point out the nature of the Spirit's work in Peter's life, because he was not able to process it. He wasn't able to take it in, or he wasn't able to see it prior to this. he has this heavenly engagement. He falls into a trance. It takes that much. And in the trance, the sheets lowered. He has this experience where he sees all these different kinds of food, that would make him gag, right? Like the thought of eating them would make him gag. He couldn't even stomach the idea. And then immediately, at the same time, God is speaking to Cornelius, this Gentile, this Roman who's a soldier. He embodied everything that was against the Jews. He was a Roman. He was part of the empire that was squashing the Jewish people, holding them down, mistreating them. And this guy, his entourage, shows up right as the trance is ending. Ding dong. And what God shows Peter is that the gag reflex that he experiences in the trance is really meant to point him to the gag reflex of his own soul toward those people. So if we frame up conversion theologically in salvation as that work that God does by his Spirit to open your eyes to your own sin and need, and simultaneously to open your eyes to the glory of Christ, the brilliance, the beauty of Christ, such that you no longer want to live life without him and you move toward him. I spoke of cross-cultural conversion as that work that God does in our hearts, and when he's sanctifying us, where we see the ugliness of our insularity, of our divisiveness, of our cultural superiority, and we look at others and we see something of the beauty, the creative beauty of those people and their cultures, and we move toward them because we no longer want to live life without them, because we were never meant to live life apart from them. We were always meant to be that beloved community. If you look at the beginning of the story and the end of the story, that informs what we're supposed to be doing in the middle of the story right now. And so that's what I was trying to get at with this conversion. Peter is converted in a sense to a new way of seeing not just the Gentiles, but all people. And he doesn't arrive, right? Because Galatians 2 happens after Acts 10. And Paul has to rebuke Peter for withdrawing from the Gentiles. But he's repentant, and you even see later on in Peter's letters, then when he talks about, when he addresses the church in chapter 2, he says, you're a royal priesthood, a holy nation. Like he's speaking to a mixed multitude there from the dispersion, and he's constantly wrestling with it, but now it's a battle. He doesn't just succumb to his to centering his own culture.
Yes, that was very well put. And just, so many thoughts, so many applications, but just one coming to mind as I'm thinking of Peter and Peter's life here. How often I'm constantly encouraged by the people that God chose to use.
Yes.
That Peter is not this perfect, and the Bible, does not portray people as just having it all together. You see one of the leaders of the church struggling with this issue. And as you say, in this section in Acts 10, this, so-called conversion, but then him still continuing to struggle with that in Galatians 2, and then with the rest of his life, that the Lord loves to use people that aren't all polished and squeaky clean, and continue to struggle. And so that's a great encouragement. Just obviously one thing we can take from this. Anything else to add as we close out?
I would say I would encourage people to follow out the rest of the story of Acts, and put yourself in the vantage point of the Jewish people who, their Messiah comes to them after all of this time that they have been persecuted. They've been pushed around by the nations after the fall of the kingdom. They just get pushed around, and finally their Messiah comes. And they want him to exact judgment on those people. And those people are the problem. Those people are getting in the way of everything that we hope for and dream for. But the Messiah they get doesn't want to destroy those people. He wants to include those people. And so the message for all of us, I think, is that if we want to follow this Jesus, then we have to be the kind of people who are longing for connection with those people rather than extending further divide between ourselves and those people, whoever those people are for us. So it's like we cannot just like we draw a circle around the requirements of our own love, we cannot circumscribe the love that God shows for people that we just don't really have any interest in. Like, here's the deal. If we find ourselves running away from the people we find Jesus running toward, then we need to re-examine our understanding of discipleship and what that requires of us.
Well said, Russ. That's very good. And tomorrow we will continue this conversation, specifically looking at some areas of brokenness that come up through this discussion. So thanks again, Russ.
Yeah, glad to be here.